Hey, welcome to the briefing. What I'm going to cover with you today is this. When one employee lowers the standard for everyone. This is DA Mailbag 0005, and the situation is already past the point where one difficult employee can be treated as an isolated personnel issue. An employee's attitude has deteriorated. Work quality has gone down. The pattern is known. It has happened before. The rest of the office is now performing poorly, just not as poorly as the person at the bottom. The section is being written up and money may be taken away from the contract. What began with one employee has moved into team output, customer confidence, contract performance, and leadership accountability. The person who submitted this used a blunt analogy. When a bear is chasing a group, you do not have to be the fastest person. You only have to be faster than the slowest person. That is what the office has started doing. Employees are no longer measuring themselves against the required standard. They are measuring themselves against the lowest performer leadership continues to accept. One person remains at the bottom, the next person performs slightly better, everyone else finds a safe position above the floor. The entire section can decline while almost every individual still says, "I am not the worst one here." That is the condition we need to examine because the decision in front of this manager is not simply whether to fire an employee. The decision is whether continued coaching is still responsible, whether a formal correction path remains justified, whether another role is appropriate, or whether separation has become necessary. At the same time, leadership has to determine how much damage has already been created by waiting, how the office standard will be restored, and whether the manager responsible for the section has now become part of the failure they refuse to control. Before we go further, I need to be clear about the boundary. This is a leadership and operating discussion, not individualized legal advice. Actual employment actions have to follow the organization's policies, human resources requirements, contract terms, documentation standards, and any appropriate legal review. Different workplaces and employment arrangements create different obligations. A manager should not use a podcast episode as a substitute for the process their organization requires. What we can examine is the judgment behind the decision. What should a responsible leader know before enforcing a consequence? What due diligence is owed to the employee? What responsibility is owed to the team and customer? When does patience support improvement? And when does it protect avoidance? How does a manager make a hard decision without reducing a human being to one bad month, one conflict, or one label? And how does that same manager stop fairness from becoming an excuse for leaving a known problem unresolved? The controlling principle is direct. Due diligence determines whether the standard was fair. Enforcement proves whether the standard was real. A disciplined leader has to do both. Let's place ourselves inside the office before the contract write-up arrives. The section has defined deliverables. Work has to be accurate. Deadlines matter. Customers expect usable output. Supervisors are supposed to review quality, correct misses, and keep the workload moving. One employee starts showing a change in attitude. Maybe direction is met with visible resistance. Maybe routine feedback becomes an argument. Maybe the employee withdraws, complains openly, blames coworkers, or acts as though assigned responsibilities are unreasonable. The exact behavior matters because bad attitude is too vague to support a serious decision. But something observable has changed. Work quality also declines. Details are missed. Tasks are incomplete. Documents come back for correction. Deadlines slide. Another employee has to finish what was left undone. A supervisor starts checking behind the person more often. The employee may still complete some work, but the amount of rework and supervision keeps rising. At first, every event is treated separately. One discussion about a missed deadline, one reminder about professionalism, one correction on quality, one request to communicate better, one conversation after another, each one reasonable enough on its own. The manager tells themselves they are being patient. Replacing the employee would create a vacancy. Hiring takes time. The employee has experience. Perhaps the employee is going through something. Perhaps the next conversation will finally land. The manager does not want to overreact or become the kind of leader who removes someone at the first sign of trouble. Those are legitimate concerns. Good managers should not be casual about someone's livelihood. They should not mistake irritation for evidence. They should not decide someone is disposable because leadership has not yet learned how to manage them. But while the manager keeps the issue informal, the rest of the office is building its own interpretation. They see the same work returned for correction. They see the same employee push back. They see the supervisor absorb the disruption. They see assignments quietly move to reliable people. They hear the manager ask everyone to work together, stay flexible, and help the section succeed. What they do not see is a clear endpoint. Reliable employees begin carrying more work. Sometimes they are thanked. Sometimes their extra effort is treated as normal. They begin to recognize an uncomfortable pattern. The employee who misses the standard keeps the role. The employees who meet the standard receive more responsibility. That is a dangerous reward structure. Strong performance creates additional burden. Weak performance creates accommodation, and the decline is rarely announced. One person stops volunteering. Another person stops checking their work a second time. Someone who used to stay late to protect a deadline decides the deadline belongs to management. Another employee lets a small error pass because leadership has tolerated the larger pattern for months. People do not all become openly defiant. They simply stop giving the operation more than the minimum needed to remain above the person at the bottom. That is the bear effect. The lowest accepted performance becomes the practical benchmark. The written standard still says accurate, complete, timely, professional. The operating standard becomes better than the weakest person, early enough that somebody else can recover the delay, and professional enough to avoid being the next individual called into the office. So then the customer notices. The contracting authority sees the decline. A section-level write-up appears. Money is threatened. Senior leadership asks what is happening. Suddenly the problem is treated as urgent, but it did not become urgent when the customer wrote the section up. The write-up is the late signal. The problem became urgent when management had enough information to see a repeated pattern and enough authority to begin controlling it. The deeper failure point is not merely that one employee underperformed. It is that leadership allowed the required standard and the enforced standard to separate. What leadership repeatedly allows becomes part of the operating standard, whether leadership intended that message or not. That is why the decision cannot begin with, how do we get rid of this employee? That question is too late and too narrow. The responsible question is, what decision does the complete record support, and what must leadership correct regardless of whether this employee stays or leaves? At this point, we are not operating only with unknowns. We know the supervisor has coached the employee. We know the supervisor has formally written the employee up. We know management is aware of the attitude problem, the decline in work quality, and the effect on the rest of the section. We also know the supervisor elevated the issue to the manager, explained what needed to be done, and provided guidance on how to move the process forward. Despite that, the manager has not acted. There are still facts leadership should verify before making a final employment decision. We may not know everything happening in the employee's personal life or work environment. We still need to confirm whether training was sufficient, expectations were clear, instructions were consistent, and the documented record accurately reflects the employee's conduct and performance. But those remaining questions do not erase what has already occurred. The employee has been coached. The issue has been documented. The concern has been escalated. The decision maker has been informed. That changes the leadership problem. Due diligence is no longer limited to gathering more information about the employee. It now requires management to review the established record, confirm that the process was fair, determine whether another corrective opportunity is supported, and make the decision the evidence requires. If the supervisor has completed the coaching, documentation, and escalation within the scope of the role, and the manager still refuses to act, the failure is no longer confined to the employee's performance. It has become a management failure to enforce the standard and control a known organizational risk. Due diligence still needs an endpoint. It cannot become an endless return to the beginning every time the manager becomes uncomfortable with the next decision. Management knows the employee's attitude and work quality have declined, knows the team is being affected, and knows the contract is now exposed. At this stage, another informal conversation is not automatically more fairness. Another month is not automatically another legitimate opportunity. Sending the employee back through the same undefined coaching cycle is not an improvement plan. Sending the supervisor back to collect more of the same evidence is not additional due diligence. If management identifies a material gap, close that specific gap. If training was never verified, verify it. If the standard was unclear, clarify it. If the employee was never given a measurable correction, period, determine whether one remains justified. If human resources has not reviewed the record, engage them, but do not reopen every question merely because leadership has reached the point where a decision carries consequence. That is where due diligence can become theater. Everyone appears active. Meetings occur. Notes are added. The employee remains in place. The supervisor continues managing the same conduct. The team continues carrying the same rework. The contract continues measuring the same decline. Nothing is resolved. Leadership has to distinguish between information that could change the decision and information being requested only to delay the decision. This is where the moving storm model matters. The situation is not standing still while the manager decides whether to act. The employee continues working. The supervisor continues trying to control the section. The team continues watching. The customer continues receiving output. The contract continues measuring performance. The storm keeps moving. The employee's work quality may improve, remain unstable, or decline further. The attitude problem may settle, or it may create more friction. The employee may respond to the formal write-up, or may learn that even formal documentation produces no meaningful endpoint. The supervisor also receives a message. The supervisor has coached the employee, documented the condition, elevated the risk, and attempted to guide the manager toward the next action. If management still refuses to decide, the supervisor learns that formal escalation does not produce support. That creates a second leadership problem. Why should a supervisor continue addressing difficult employee issues early if every serious escalation is returned without disposition? Why document carefully if the record sits unused? Why hold the standard when the person with greater authority will not enforce it? The rest of the team sees the same pattern. They may not know the private details. They do not need to. They can see that the conduct continues, the work continues to require correction, and the supervisor does not appear to have enough organizational support to close the issue. Every day teaches the section something about the real standard. Waiting is not neutral. Every day after management becomes aware of the problem becomes part of the answer to a later question. What did you do after you knew? Think about the storm in bands. At the center is the employee. Their capability, conduct, attitude, work quality, reliability, response to coaching, response to the formal write-up, and potential for sustained correction. The employee is still a person, not merely a performance entry. Fairness still matters. Relevant facts still matter. The employee's response still matters. But fairness does not require leadership to pretend previous actions never occurred. The next band is the role. What duties are being missed? What work requires correction? What deadlines are affected? What handoffs are failing? How much additional supervision is required? What customer requirement is weakened? A performance problem becomes operational when other people have to change their work to compensate for it. The next band is the team. Who is caring more? Who has stopped volunteering? Who no longer believes strong performance is treated fairly? Who has begun comparing their work to the lowest accepted level instead of the required level? The team may never announce that the standard has dropped. Their behavior will show it. The outer band is the organization and contract, customer confidence, formal write-ups, financial deductions, reputation, contract renewal risk, Leadership credibility. The organization's ability to explain why a known condition was allowed to continue. But there is another storm moving through every one of those bands, the management response. The supervisor acted, the supervisor coached the employee, the supervisor documented the issue, the supervisor elevated the matter, the supervisor attempted to prepare management to take the next step. Management was informed. The unresolved question is no longer whether anyone recognized the problem. The unresolved question is why the manager with decision authority did not produce a disposition. Did the manager review the record? Did the manager identify a specific due diligence gap? Did the manager involve human resources? Did the manager request additional authority? Did the manager establish another measurable corrective action? Did the manager approve reassignment? Did the manager recommend separation? Did the manager communicate any decision back to the supervisor? Or did the manager allow the condition to remain open while the team and contract continued absorbing the risk? That is the second storm. A manager can become so focused on avoiding the consequence of a decision that they fail to recognize that their inaction has become its own decision. The employee may be the initial performance problem. The manager's refusal to act after coaching, documentation, and escalation can become the larger leadership failure. I want to use careful language here. Not every delay is deliberate protection of bad behavior. Some managers are inexperienced. Some are uncertain about policy. Some inherited a poor process. Some are waiting for human resources guidance. Some do not possess final termination authority. But a lack of final authority does not eliminate responsibility. If the manager cannot terminate, the manager can recommend. If the manager cannot approve the recommendation, the manager can escalate. If information is missing, the manager can identify exactly what is missing and establish a deadline to obtain it. If human resources controls the next step, the manager can engage human resources and document the contract risk. If senior leadership owns the final decision, the manager can elevate the complete record and request a disposition. Leadership responsibility does not end where personal authority ends. It changes from direct action to controlled escalation. When a manager knows the problem exists, knows that coaching and documentation have already occurred, knows that the damage is spreading, and still fails to act or escalate, that inaction can become tacit acceptance. The manager may not have caused the employee's original decline. The manager can still become accountable for why the condition continued after the organization had enough information to respond. That brings us to the three questions every leader should be prepared to answer. What did you know? What did you do? Who did you tell? These questions are simple enough to remember, but they expose the entire accountability chain. Start with the supervisor. What did the supervisor know? The supervisor knew the employee's attitude had become a problem. The supervisor knew work quality had declined. The supervisor knew the behavior was affecting more than the individual employee. The supervisor could see that the rest of the office was beginning to recalibrate downward. What did the supervisor do? The supervisor coached the employee. The supervisor formally wrote the employee up. The supervisor documented the issue and attempted to enforce the standard within the authority of the position. But the supervisor can answer all three questions. The supervisor knew the problem, acted within the authority of the position, and elevated the issue to the manager responsible for the next decision. If the manager provided no feedback, requested no additional action, identified no gap in the process, and gave no direction to continue corrective steps, that silence reasonably signals to the supervisor that the required work at their level was complete. The supervisor should not be left guessing whether more action is expected. Once the issue has been coached, documented, and elevated, management must either confirm that the process is sufficient, identify exactly what remains incomplete, or make the next decision. Silence is not direction. It leaves the supervisor carrying responsibility without authority and allows the unresolved risk to continue moving through the team and contract. Now apply those same questions to the manager. What did the manager know? The manager knew the employee had been coached. The manager knew a formal write-up existed. The manager knew attitude and work quality were affecting the section. The manager knew the supervisor was requesting a decision. The manager knew contract performance was deteriorating or at risk. What did the manager do? That is the critical question. Did the manager review the evidence? Did the manager close a specific due diligence gap? Did the manager involve the appropriate authority? Did the manager establish the next corrective action? Did the manager decide that another opportunity was justified? Did the manager determine that reassignment should be considered? Did the manager recommend separation, or did the manager simply leave the matter unresolved? Then comes the third question. Who did the manager tell? Did the manager inform human resources? Did the manager notify senior leadership? Did the manager communicate contract risk to the proper owner? Did the manager request authority to act? Did the manager provide a recommendation? Did the manager document that the issue had exceeded the manager's own decision authority? A weak answer would be, I knew the supervisor was having problems with the employee, but I wanted to give it more time. More time for what? What condition was expected to change? What action was supposed to produce that change? What measure would determine whether the additional time worked? A controlled answer would sound different. I reviewed the coaching record and formal write-up, confirmed the standard and prior support, engaged human resources, evaluated the continuing risk, and determined whether the record supported a final improvement period, reassignment, or separation. The difference is control. A leader can attend meetings, read emails, and acknowledge concerns without managing the problem. Awareness is not action. Concern is not action. Agreeing that something needs to be done is not action. Action produces a defined next step, an owner, a review point, and a consequence. When the customer asks why the section continued declining, when senior leadership reviews the threatened contract deduction, or when human resources asks why a documented performance issue remained unresolved, those three questions will move through the chain. What did you know? What did you do? Who did you tell? If a leader cannot answer them within the scope of the position and to the standard the responsibility requires, that leader may no longer be standing outside the failure, explaining what happened. They may be standing inside the accountability chain as the next casualty of the event. That word is strong. It should be. It does not mean the manager will automatically be terminated. It means known inaction carries professional risk. The manager can lose credibility, authority, contract responsibility, promotion opportunity, the confidence of the supervisor, and the trust of the team. The original employee problem can consume the manager who continued stepping around it. Now, management still has to determine what kind of employee problem the record actually shows, but the assessment should not restart from zero. The manager should review the existing coaching and write-up to determine what has already been established. Is this primarily a skill problem? Was the employee attempting the work but unable to meet the standard? Did the employee engage with coaching? Did performance improve when instruction was provided? Is there a specific capability gap that can reasonably be closed? If so, a structured development path may remain appropriate. But training has to produce a measurable result. The employee cannot remain permanently protected by the phrase "still learning" when the role requires independent performance and coaching has already occurred. Is this primarily a will problem? Has the employee demonstrated the ability to perform the work? Did performance improve only while closely watched? Did the employee resist ownership, reject direction, or return to the same behavior after coaching? Did the formal write-up produce any sustained change? If the person knows the standard and can meet it but repeatedly chooses not to, the problem is no longer solved through additional explanation. A will problem requires accountability and an endpoint. Were expectations unclear, the record should show what the employee was told. Was acceptable performance defined? Were examples provided? Were deadlines and consequences clear? Were instructions consistent? A leader cannot fairly enforce a standard that existed only in the leader's head. But if the supervisor already clarified the requirement during coaching and formal documentation, management should not keep declaring the expectation unclear without identifying the actual ambiguity. Is the problem role fit? The employee may possess useful capability, but be wrong for the pace, judgment, independence, detail, or customer exposure the current role requires. Reassignment may be responsible when a legitimate role exists and the employee can meet that role's requirements, but reassignment cannot become a method for moving a known conduct or accountability problem where it becomes less visible. That is displacement, not correction. The purpose of this review is not to decide whether the employee is a good person or a bad person. The purpose is to determine whether the employee can and will meet the legitimate standard of the role, whether the organization provided a fair opportunity, and whether the existing record supports another corrective path that preserves humanity without erasing accountability. A person can be struggling and still be responsible for their conduct. A person can be wrong for a role without being worthless. A person can have legitimate personal pressure and still create unacceptable operational consequences. A manager can consider all of that without allowing the standard to disappear. Now, ACE becomes important. ACE challenges the conclusion before management commits to it. What evidence supports another opportunity? Did the employee show measurable improvement? Did the employee accept ownership? Was the prior coaching incomplete? Was there a legitimate training gap? Was the formal write-up recent enough that the employee has not yet had a reasonable opportunity to respond? Does the record show a realistic path to sustained correction? Then ACE tests the opposite side. What evidence supports separation or another decisive action? Has the behavior repeated after coaching? Did work quality continue declining? Did improvement occur only under direct supervision? Did the employee reject ownership? Did the formal write-up fail to change the pattern? Has the employee's performance now affected the team and contract? Would another opportunity be supported by evidence, or would it only protect management from having to decide? ACE matters because managers can become emotionally committed to either side. One manager may want the employee gone and interpret every fact as proof. Another manager may want to avoid separation and reinterpret every failure as temporary. ACE forces both leaders to examine what contradicts their preferred answer. What evidence are you using? What evidence are you ignoring? What assumption are you treating as fact? What would have to be true for the opposite decision to be correct? This is not about extending the process indefinitely. It is about ensuring that the final decision survives challenge. Once ACE has tested the conclusion, PRO examines risk. PRO does not ask only what happens if the employee is separated. It asks what can be damaged under every available path. At the personal level, separation can affect the employee's income, family stability, identity, confidence, and future employment. Those consequences deserve serious consideration. But continued retention also has personal consequences. Strong employees may burn out. The supervisor may lose credibility. Co-workers may become resentful. The employee at the center of the issue may remain in a role where they continue failing publicly and damaging their own professional record. At the role level, PRO asks what work becomes uncovered if the person leaves, what knowledge is lost, who carries the workload, how quickly can the role be replaced, what deliverables are exposed. It also asks what happens if the employee stays, how much rework continues, how much supervision is consumed, what responsibilities are shifted to others, what customer requirements remain vulnerable. At the organizational level, PRO examines contract performance, customer confidence, financial deductions, culture, precedent, morale, retention, and leadership credibility. What does it communicate if management acts without completing due diligence? What does it communicate if management refuses to enforce the standard after due diligence is already complete? Both decisions carry risk. The problem is that leaders often see the cost of separation clearly because it arrives all at once. Vacancy, recruiting, onboarding, work redistribution, a difficult conversation. The cost of continued retention is easier to ignore because it is spread across more people and more time, rework, supervision, reduced effort, customer dissatisfaction, contract deductions, loss of strong employees, decline in trust in leadership, Pro forces management to compare both paths honestly. It also places the manager's own inaction inside the risk picture. What happens if the manager continues refusing to decide? What happens to the supervisor's authority? What happens to the team's belief in the standard? What happens if the contracting authority concludes that management knew and failed to act? What happens if the next review asks why the formal write-up produced no disposition? The manager is not outside the risk assessment. The manager's choices are part of it. Now, brain helps examine the options before pressure forces a decision. What information is still materially missing? Not what information would be nice to have. What information could actually change the decision? What are the benefits of another formal improvement period? What are the risks? What alternative paths exist? Is reassignment legitimate? Is the employee qualified for another role? Would moving the person solve the performance issue or merely move the disruption? What is the timing pressure? How much additional exposure can the section and contract absorb? What would a defensible decision require? A brain should not be used to generate endless possibilities. It should help management understand the available options well enough to choose among them. If the information is already sufficient, more analysis becomes delay. Then PACE prepares the organization for what happens after the decision. The primary path may be sustained correction. The employee meets the required standard, conduct improves, work quality stabilizes, and the person remains in the role. If that is the primary path, management has to define what sustained correction means. What will be measured? Who will review it? How often? What happens if the improvement does not hold? The alternate path may be a final formal improvement period, not another vague conversation. A measurable and time-bound opportunity that identifies the required standard, available support, review date, and consequence. The contingency path may be reassignment or replacement preparation. If the employee cannot succeed in the current role but may perform in another legitimate position, that option can be evaluated. At the same time, management may need to prepare recruiting, redistribution, or temporary coverage. The emergency path may be immediate removal from certain duties, or separation when conduct, customer impact, contract exposure, policy, or another serious risk requires faster action. PACE is not used to postpone the decision. It is used to prevent leadership from reaching the decision with no plan for the next operating condition. If the employee leaves, who owns the work? What deliverables are at risk? What access must be controlled? What knowledge can be transferred? How will the customer be protected? How will the team be informed without exposing private employment information? How quickly can the position be covered? If the employee stays, what changes immediately? What standard will be measured? What support is appropriate? Who owns the review? How will leadership prevent the strongest employees from carrying the employee's recovery? What happens if the pattern returns? A decision without a next path creates another uncontrolled problem. That is how ACE, PRO, BRAIN, and PACE work together here. ACE tests whether the conclusion is supported. PRO shows what each path can damage. BRAIN examines the information, benefits, risks, alternatives, and timing. PACE prepares the organization to operate after the choice is made. None of those tools replaces management judgment. They make the judgment more disciplined and more difficult to hide from. Now we come to the decision control chart. The chart should not function like a machine that produces retain or terminate. It should stop management from choosing based on fear, anger, friendship, sympathy, inconvenience, or the latest incident. The first control point is the required standard. What exactly does the role require? Is the expectation measurable or observable? Is it reasonable? Is it tied to the employee's actual responsibilities? Was it communicated? Was it applied consistently? The second control point is the established record. What coaching occurred? What was included in the formal write-up? What examples were documented? What impact was identified? What did the employee say? What happened after the coaching? What happened after the write-up? The third control point is due diligence. Was the employee heard? Was training reviewed? Were relevant circumstances considered? Was the workload reasonable? Were instructions consistent? Was the process aligned with organizational policy? The fourth control point is the employee's response. Did the employee accept responsibility? Did conduct improve? Did work quality improve? Was the improvement sustained? Did the same pattern return? Did the employee engage with support? The fifth control point is the continuing impact. Is the team still carrying rework? Is the supervisor still spending disproportionate time controlling one employee? Is the office standard still declining? Is the customer experiencing the issue? Is contract money at risk? The sixth control point is management disposition. This is the point that must now be emphasized. Did the manager review the record? Did the manager identify a specific missing requirement? Did the manager engage the proper authority? Did the manager make or request a decision? Did the manager communicate the disposition back to the supervisor? Did the manager establish a deadline? If management cannot answer those questions, the control chart has exposed the current failure point. At a high level, the chart should move toward one of four zones. Continued development when the record shows that expectations or training were incomplete, and the employee demonstrates credible recovery potential. A final formal improvement period when the problem is established, but one defined, measurable, time-bound opportunity remains justified. Reassignment when the primary issue is legitimate role fit and another appropriate position exists. Separation when the standard was clear, due diligence was completed, coaching and documentation occurred, improvement did not happen or did not hold, and continued employment creates unacceptable risk. The chart does not make the hard decision easy. It makes the decision explainable, disciplined, and connected to the record. A weak manager may want the chart to choose for them. It cannot. The supervisor cannot choose for the manager. Human resources cannot replace the manager's operating recommendation. The chart cannot absorb accountability. The manager still has to reach a conclusion, request the necessary authority, and own the result. This is where the hard right and easy left must be understood correctly. The hard right is not automatically the harshest action. The easy left is whichever path allows the leader to avoid immediate discomfort. Sometimes the easy path is firing someone quickly because coaching, documentation, and development require work. That is not the situation described here. The supervisor is already coached and documented. The more likely easy path now is leaving the matter unresolved because a final decision creates staffing pressure, administrative work, conflict, or personal discomfort for the manager. That does not make continued delay compassionate. It transfers the consequence. The manager avoids the decision. The supervisor carries the unresolved employee. The team carries the rework. The customer receives the reduced output. The contract carries the financial exposure. The hard right is the responsible decision supported by the complete record. It may still be another formal opportunity if the evidence justifies it. It may be reassignment if the role fit is genuinely the problem. It may be separation if the employee has received a fair opportunity and the pattern remains. But the hard right cannot be permanent indecision. The hard right requires due diligence and enforcement. Without due diligence, enforcement becomes reckless. Without enforcement, due diligence becomes theater. Now return to the office where the whole section is performing poorly. Leadership may be tempted to issue a broad warning and tell everyone to improve. A section-level reset may be necessary because the contract measures collective output. But broad accountability cannot become a method for avoiding individual accountability. If one employee is repeatedly producing the weakest work, resisting correction, and transferring workload to others, that issue has to be addressed directly. If the manager has allowed the documented problem to continue, that leadership failure also has to be addressed directly. If other employees deliberately reduce their own performance, each employee still owns that choice. The bare effect explains the drift. It does not excuse anyone from returning to the standard. The reset should be operational. This is the required output. This is how quality will be measured. This is the contract requirement. This is what has not been met. This is who owns each recovery action. This is how often performance will be reviewed. This is what happens when the standard is not met. Then leadership has to follow through. The team will not believe the standard because the manager gives a forceful speech. They will believe it when the standard is applied consistently. They will believe it when strong employees are recognized instead of repeatedly burdened. They will believe it when poor performance is addressed early. They will believe it when the supervisor receives support after escalating a documented problem. High performers should not become the permanent contingency plan for poor performers. Temporary assistance may be necessary. Treating the most reliable people as unlimited recovery capacity is not. When leadership rewards reliability with additional work while protecting poor performance from consequence, strong employees learn to hide their capability. That lesson can remain even after the original employee leaves. Trust will have to be rebuilt. The team has to see that workload will be controlled, performance will be measured, and the same pattern will not be allowed to form around another employee. Now move both possible decisions forward. Assume management grants another formal improvement period. What is different this time? What new evidence justifies it? Is the standard measurable? Is support defined? Is the timeline appropriate? Will the manager review actual work? Does the employee understand what must change and what happens if it does not? If the answer is another month of watching the situation, management has not created a new path. Time by itself is not an intervention. Another opportunity is responsible only when its structure gives the employee a fair and realistic chance to produce a different result. During that period, the team also needs protection. Coworkers should not become informal monitors. The strongest employee should not be made responsible for checking every task. The supervisor should not be left carrying the process without management support. Privacy matters, but operational ownership also matters. The team does not need confidential details. They do need to see that standards, workload, customer commitments, and leadership actions are under control. Now assume management recommends separation. The storm continues. Who covers the work? What deliverables are exposed? What knowledge can be captured? What access must be controlled? How quickly can the role be replaced? How will the team be informed? How will customer continuity be protected? How will leadership prevent the belief that removing one person solved every problem in the section? Separation may be the correct employee decision and still be an incomplete organizational response. Management has to restore the review rhythm, feedback discipline, workload control, and early escalation that should have prevented the issue from reaching the contract. The final conversation with the employee matters. A hard decision does not require humiliation. Do not unload months of frustration. Do not turn the meeting into a judgment of the employee's entire character. Do not use private team complaints as ammunition. Be direct, factual, controlled, and respectful. If the employee remains under a final improvement period, that conversation requires the same level of clarity. What must change? What evidence will show improvement? What support is available? What is the review date? What happens if the standard is not met? The employee should not leave a serious meeting believing it was another casual coaching conversation. The team conversation also requires discipline. Leadership cannot share private employment information, but silence cannot become confusion. Employees need to know that the required standard remains in place. Workload will be redistributed deliberately, performance will be reviewed consistently, and management is acting. Do not turn the employee into a public lesson. Reset the work, not the gossip. The manager also needs to inspect their own choices. When did I first know? What did I do after the supervisor elevated the issue? Why did I not reach a decision? Was a material fact missing, or was I avoiding discomfort? Did I engage the proper authority? Did I communicate the contract risk? Did I leave the supervisor responsible for a problem without providing enough authority to resolve it? Did I wait for the customer to create urgency? That reflection is not self-punishment. It is leadership correction. A manager who refuses to inspect their own role will recreate the same pattern with another employee. I've seen versions of this problem in different environments. A supervisor does the early work, coaching happens, documentation happens, the issue is elevated. Then the process stalls at the level where the consequence has to be approved. The team keeps compensating. The customer sees the accumulated result. When management finally acts, the original employee problem is only one part of the repair. Experience teaches you to respect the smaller signals. Repeated rework. One supervisor checking one employee more than everyone else. Strong employees becoming quiet. Assignments being moved without a formal decision. The same conduct continuing after coaching. A formal write-up producing no management disposition. Those are not small administrative issues. They show the required standard and the enforced standard moving apart. The lesson is not to terminate faster. The lesson is to manage earlier and decide when the record is ready. Early management gives the employee the best chance to recover. It gives the supervisor organizational support. It gives the manager stronger evidence. It protects the team. It gives the organization more options. Delay makes every path harder. So what should happen next? Management should review the existing record immediately. The coaching, the formal write-up, the performance evidence, the employee's response, the team impact, the contract exposure, the supervisor's recommendation. Do not send the supervisor back through another informal coaching cycle unless the review identifies a specific reason that coaching was incomplete. Do not request more documentation without identifying what material question the additional documentation is expected to answer. Engage the appropriate organizational authority, human resources, senior leadership, contract management, legal review when required. The manager should not carry a high-consequence employment decision alone, but the manager must initiate and support the process. Then apply ACE. What evidence supports another opportunity? What evidence supports a more decisive action? What contradiction remains unresolved? Then apply PRO. What can be damaged if the employee stays? What can be damaged if the employee leaves? What can be damaged if management continues to delay? Then use BRAIN. What information is materially missing? What benefits and risks exist under each option? What alternatives are legitimate? What timing pressure matters? Then build PACE. What is the primary path? What is the alternate? What contingency is required? What emergency action becomes necessary if the condition crosses another threshold? Then make the recommendation the record supports. Prepare work coverage, protect customer continuity, control team communication, prepare hiring, reassignment, or the final improvement process. Establish follow-up. The decision is not complete when the employee meeting ends. It is complete when the work, standard, and accountability chain are back under control. Remember the office-wide standard. The lowest performer may have become the comparison point, but every employee remains responsible for returning to the actual requirement. The bare effect explains how the section drifted. It does not excuse the drift. Explanation helps leadership correct the system. It does not remove accountability. If you leave this briefing with one field level control, use the next leadership review to ask 3 questions. What did you know? What did you do? Who did you tell? Then examine the answers through ACE, PRO, BRAIN, and PACE. Does the evidence support the conclusion? What risk exists under every path? What information and alternatives still matter? What plan controls the operation after the decision? Those questions do not automatically decide whether an employee should be separated. They reveal whether leadership is creating control or merely documenting concern. A hard decision made on weak evidence is still weak. A delayed decision after the evidence is sufficient is avoidance. Here's the final distinction I want you to carry. Compassion and standards are not enemies. Fairness and enforcement are not enemies. You can care about an employee's circumstances and still require the work to meet the standard. You can acknowledge management mistakes and still hold the employee accountable. You can provide support and still define an endpoint. You can make a separation decision without treating the person as disposable. You can protect the team without turning the process into punishment. The easy version of leadership divides those responsibilities. It says you either care about the employee or protect the standard. You either give another chance or become harsh. You either blame the individual or blame the system. That is a false choice. The employee is part of the system. The supervisor is part of the system. The manager is part of the system. The team is part of the system. The customer and contract are measuring the system's output. The decision has to account for all of it. A leader does not need perfect certainty. Perfect certainty may never arrive. The leader needs enough evidence, enough due diligence, enough objectivity, and enough courage to act before continued delay becomes the controlling decision, because the storm is still moving. The employee is still performing, the supervisor is still carrying the issue, the team is still watching, the customer is still receiving the work, the contract is still measuring the result, and management is still building an accountability record. And what did you know? What did you do? Who did you tell? If you cannot answer those questions within the scope of your position and to the standard your responsibility requires, you may not remain a witness to the failure. You may become its next accountability casualty. Due diligence protects the employee from an unfair decision. Enforcement protects the supervisor, team, customer, contract, and organization from an unresolved problem. A disciplined leader must be prepared to do both. When you are ready to go deeper with these tools, go to www.direct-action-system.io/course-directory. Open the course directory, find the course tied to the capability you need to strengthen, and start there. That is where the deeper application belongs. Thanks for listening to the briefing.